3 witnesses, 30 feet, 3 minutes maximum. That's all it took for a 20-year-old man to disappear from his own backyard in broad daylight on a Wednesday afternoon. No screams, no struggle, no goodbye, just the hollow sound of a shed door that may or may not have been opened. And then nothing. Silence that has lasted 24 years. But here's what makes this case different from every other missing person story you've heard. This didn't happen in a sprawling city where someone can vanish into crowds. This happened in Skidmore, Missouri. Population 342. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where secrets are supposed to be impossible to keep. Except Skidmore has proven time and time again that it's very, very good at keeping secrets. In 1981, 20 years before Branson Perry walked toward that shed, a man was shot to death on Main Street in front of at least 50 witnesses. The murder happened at 10:30 in the morning, in broad daylight, and not a single person saw who pulled the trigger. Or at least, that's what they all said. The FBI investigated. Local authorities investigated. Grand juries convened. And 44 years later, no one has ever been charged. The town had learned how to look away, so when Branson Perry vanished on April 11, 2001, the question wasn't just what happened to him. The question was whether anyone would ever admit they knew. This is the story of a young man who walked 30 feet and disappeared. A story about a town that knows how to keep its mouth shut, and a case where 3 people watched him go, and somehow, no one saw anything at all. Branson Kane Perry was born on February 24, 1981. The same year Ken Rex McElroy was murdered on Skidmore's Main Street. Perhaps that timing was prophetic. Perhaps it was just a coincidence. But Branson would become part of Skidmore's dark mythology, another name that people outside the town knew better than anyone who lived there. He grew up the son of Bob Perry and Rebecca Kleino, who everyone called Becky. When his parents divorced, Branson chose to live with his father at 304 West Oak Street. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't fancy. It was a modest house on a quiet street in a town that barely qualified as a dot on the map. But it was home. Those who knew Branson described him with surprising consistency. Compassionate, nature-loving, someone who genuinely cared about the world around him. His aunt, Gail McMurray, would later tell reporters that Branson loved camping, loved the outdoors, loved anything that got him away from the confines of everyday life. He had dreams that stretched beyond the borders of Nottoway County. After graduating from Nottoway Holt High School in 1990, Branson took whatever work he could find. For a while he worked as a roofer. Hard labor under the Missouri sun, the kind of job that builds calluses and character in equal measure. When that dried up, he found something that suited him better. He helped maintain a traveling petting zoo, animals, fresh air, children's laughter. It was the kind of work that spoke to who he really was. But Branson wasn't just the gentle soul his family remembered. He was also deeply human, which meant deeply complicated. He had a black belt in Hapkido, a Korean martial art that emphasizes joint locks and throws. He was a weightlifter. He had the kind of physical discipline that requires dedication. But he also suffered from tachycardia, a condition that made his heart race uncontrollably. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A young man training his body to be strong, while his heart betrayed him with irregular rhythms that came without warning. And then there was the part of Branson's life that he kept more private. His father Bob knew his son was gay. It wasn't a secret within the family. It wasn't something they fought about or tried to change. But, in a town of 342 people, being different in any way came with scrutiny. Every choice was noticed. Every relationship was discussed. Privacy was a luxury that didn't exist. In the weeks before he disappeared, Branson had begun experimenting with drugs, marijuana, methamphetamines. It started as experimentation, the way it often does. But it was spiraling. His Aunt Gail would later reveal that Branson had confided in her that he wanted to get clean. He wanted to pull himself out before it got worse. She said she knew about his love of camping, his love of nature, his love of life, but she hadn't known about the drugs, not until it was too late. So who was Branson Perry? He was a 20-year-old trying to figure out his place in the world. He was a son who loved his parents, a young man dealing with a medical condition, someone who worked hard, someone who loved animals and the outdoors, someone who was gay in a small town, someone who had started making dangerous choices, someone whose life was messy and beautiful and complicated in the way that all of our lives are. And then, on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, he walked 30 feet from his house and became a ghost. Before we can understand what happened to Branson Perry, we need to understand Skidmore, Missouri. This isn't just context. This is essential. Because Skidmore isn't like other small towns. Skidmore has a reputation. And that reputation matters. Skidmore was founded in 1880 by Martin Skidmore. It sits in Nottoway County, tucked into the northwest corner of Missouri, about 46 miles north of St. Joseph, and roughly 100 miles north of Kansas City. Drive past it and you might not even notice it's there. Population hovers somewhere around 300, give or take depending on who's moving in or out. It should be anonymous. One of those thousands of American small towns that exist in comfortable obscurity. But Skidmore is world famous, and not for anything good. On July 10, 1981, Ken Rex McElroy was shot to death while sitting in his pickup truck outside the D&G Tavern on Main Street. It was 10:30 in the morning. At least 50 people were present when it happened. He was struck by bullets from two different firearms. One shot went through his neck, another tore through his head. He died behind the wheel while his wife sat next to him, uninjured. And nobody saw anything. Ken McElroy wasn't just disliked, he was loathed. For decades, he had terrorized the town. He was a cattle rustler, a thief, an arsonist. He was accused or suspected of assault, rape, and child molestation. He had been charged with crimes 21 times. 21 times. And he walked free every time. Witnesses refused to testify because McElroy would show up at their homes, park his truck outside, and sit there for hours, staring, waiting, making it clear what would happen if they talked. In 1973, McElroy impregnated a 12-year-old girl named Trina McLeod. When she turned 14 and gave birth to his child, he divorced his wife and married Trina to avoid statutory rape charges. She was 14 years old. In 1976, McElroy shot farmer Romaine Henry twice with a shotgun, after Henry confronted him about shooting weapons on Henry's property. McElroy was charged with assault with intent to kill. At trial, he produced witnesses who swore they were hunting with him that day, and he was nowhere near the scene. He was found not guilty. In 1980, McElroy walked into a grocery store and shot the 70-year-old grocer in the neck over a dispute about a piece of stolen candy. The grocer survived. McElroy was convicted of assault but released on bond while he appealed. And then he went right back to the streets, armed with a rifle, making public threats against the grocer who had dared to press charges. On the morning of July 10, 1981, townspeople met with the Nottoway County Sheriff at the local hall. They wanted to know what could be done about McElroy. The sheriff suggested forming a neighborhood watch. He told them not to confront McElroy. Then he left town. After the sheriff left, the group walked down the street to the D&G Tavern where McElroy was drinking. When McElroy came out and got into his truck with his wife, approximately 50 people surrounded the vehicle. Shots rang out. McElroy slumped over the steering wheel, bleeding from his neck and head. His wife escaped unharmed. According to reports, no one called an ambulance. Trina McElroy named a suspect, but in a town of witnesses, nobody would confirm anything. The FBI investigated. State police investigated. Local authorities brought in grand juries. It didn't matter. The investigation went nowhere. The case remains officially unsolved to this day. The story made international headlines. Books were written. A TV movie was made. Decades later, the Sundance TV documentary series No One Saw a Thing would revisit the case, trying to untangle what really happened and whether vigilante justice could ever be justified. But the lesson Skidmore learned wasn't about justice. The lesson was about silence. The town had come together, dealt with a problem that the law couldn't handle, and then closed ranks so tightly that no amount of federal pressure could crack it open. Skidmore had learned that if everyone kept their mouth shut, no one could be held accountable. So when Branson Perry disappeared 20 years later, he vanished into a town that had already proven it could make someone disappear and never say a word about it. April 7th, 2001. 4 days before Branson Perry would vanish. This is where the story really begins. Branson visited his neighbor Jason Bierman. Bierman was in his 30s. Branson was 20 years old. What happened in that house would set off a chain of events that Branson's family believes is directly connected to his disappearance. According to what Branson later told his father, Bierman gave him an unidentified drug. The details of what happened next are disturbing and specific. While intoxicated, Branson stripped naked and danced around Bierman's house. He shaved off his pubic hair. And then he engaged in sexual activity with Bierman. When Branson came down from whatever he had been given, he was devastated. He told his father everything. Bob Perry already knew his son was gay. That wasn't the issue. The issue was that Bob believed Bierman had deliberately drugged his son and then sexually assaulted him while he was incapacitated. Bob was furious. According to true crime author Diane Fanning, who researched the case extensively, Bob Perry even entertained dark thoughts about confronting Bierman, maybe teaching him a lesson he wouldn't forget. But Bob never acted on those thoughts. There was no confrontation, no police report, no public accusation. Whether that was because Bob didn't want to expose his son to small-town gossip, or because he was still figuring out what to do, we don't know. What we do know is that 4 days later Branson would be gone. 4 days. That's how long the tension simmered. 4 days of Branson living with the humiliation of what had happened. 4 days of Bob Perry stewing in anger at the neighbor who lived right across the street. 4 days in a town where everyone knows everyone's business, where rumors spread like wildfire, where nothing stays secret for long. Did Jason Bierman know that Branson had told his father? Did he suspect? Was he worried? These are questions that investigators would later ask, but the answers remain unclear. What is clear is that something fundamental shifted in those 4 days. Branson was upset, his father was angry, and Jason Bierman was, at minimum, aware that something had happened that could destroy his reputation if it became public knowledge. Meanwhile, Branson's father was scheduled to be in the hospital. Bob Perry had a medical issue that required a brief stay. He was supposed to come home on Friday, April 13th. That meant Branson would be alone in the house for a few days, responsible for keeping things in order until his father returned. In those final days, Branson tried to maintain normalcy. He made plans to clean the house before his father came back. He reached out to friends. He went about his daily routine as best he could. But beneath the surface, there were stresses that were building. The sexual assault, 4 days earlier. The ongoing drug experimentation that his aunt would later reveal he wanted to escape. The weight of living in a small town where being different meant being watched. And then there was the car. Bob Perry's vehicle had a broken alternator. It had given out, and arrangements had been made for 2 men to come to the house and replace it. These 2 men would become critical figures in the story, because they were present on the property when Branson disappeared. And yet, somehow, they claimed they didn't see anything unusual. On the morning of April 11, 2001, Branson Perry woke up in his father's house on West Oak Street. His father was still in the hospital in Maryville, about a 30-minute drive away. The house was quiet. The day ahead seemed ordinary. Clean the house, help with the car repair, wait for his father to come home in 2 days. Nobody knew that by the end of the afternoon, Branson Perry would be gone, and that 24 years later, no one would know where he went or what happened to him. 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Wednesday, April 11, 2001. Branson Perry was at home at 304 West Oak Street in Skidmore, Missouri. His father, Bob, was still hospitalized in Maryville and expected to come home in 2 days. Branson wanted the house to be clean when his father returned, so he'd asked his longtime friend, Jenna Crawford, to come over and help him tidy up. Jenna agreed. The 2 of them spent the afternoon cleaning, putting things in order, making the house presentable. And according to what Jenna would later tell police, at some point during that afternoon she and Branson used drugs together. Marijuana and methamphetamines, to be specific. Outside in the driveway, 2 men were working on Bob Perry's car. The alternator had failed, and these mechanics had been hired to replace it. The weather that day was mild. Spring in Missouri. Not too hot, not too cold. The kind of day where you could work outside comfortably. So picture the scene. Branson and Jenna inside the house, cleaning and talking. 2 men outside in the driveway, working on the car. A quiet street in a tiny town on a Wednesday afternoon. Everything ordinary. Everything normal. And then, at some point around 3 o'clock, Branson grabbed something from inside the house and told Jenna he was going outside. According to Jenna's later statements to police, Branson said he was taking jumper cables to the shed. The shed was located behind the house, a short walk from the back door. 30 feet, maybe less. A trip that should have taken 2 minutes, 3 at most. Grab the cables, walk to the shed, put them inside, come back. Jenna watched him go. Or at least, she was aware he left. The details here get hazy depending on which account you read. Some sources say Branson yelled up to her through a window that he was just going to the shed and would be right back. Other accounts suggest he simply stepped out without much fanfare. What happened next is where the story fractures into impossibility. Branson walked out of the house toward the shed. The 2 mechanics were in the driveway. working on the car. They would have been within eyesight of the backyard. 30 feet isn't far. You can see someone clearly at that distance. You can hear them. You can track their movements without even trying. Gina waited inside. Minutes passed. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15. At some point, the waiting turned from casual to concerned. Where was he? How long does it take to put jumper cables in a shed? She went outside to check. The shed door was closed. Or maybe it was open, depending on which version of events you believe. But Branson wasn't there. She called his name. No response. She walked around the property. Nothing. She went back inside, thinking maybe he'd come in through another door and she'd missed him. He wasn't there either. The two mechanics finished their work and left. Jenna eventually left too, though the exact timeline of when she departed isn't clear. What is clear is that by the time the sun set on April 11, 2001, Branson Perry had been gone for hours. And here's what makes this impossible. Here's what breaks reality. 3 people were on that property when Branson walked toward the shed. Jenna Crawford was inside the house. 2 mechanics were in the driveway. All 3 of them would have been able to see or hear if something had happened. A car pulling up. A struggle. A confrontation. Something. And yet, none of them saw anything. None of them heard anything. Branson Perry walked 30 feet from his house to a shed, and somewhere in that short distance he vanished. No screams. No sounds of a vehicle. No signs of a struggle. Just absence where a person used to be. April 12, 2001. The day after Branson disappeared. His grandmother, Joanne Stinnett, decided to stop by the house. It wasn't unusual for her to check in. Bob was still in the hospital, and Branson was alone. She wanted to make sure everything was okay. When she arrived, something felt wrong immediately. The doors were unlocked. Not just one door, multiple doors. All of them open or unlocked. The house wasn't ransacked, but it was empty, quiet in a way that felt unnatural. She called out for Branson. No answer. She walked through the rooms, checking each one. Nothing. The house was deserted. Joanne found this unusual, but not necessarily alarming. Not yet. Branson was 20 years old. Maybe he'd gone somewhere. Maybe he was out with friends. She called the house periodically over the next few days, letting the phone ring and ring, waiting for someone to pick up. No one ever did. On April 13th, Bob Perry was discharged from the hospital later than expected. When he finally came home, he found his house empty. His son was gone. All of Branson's belongings were still there. His clothes, his wallet, his personal items. Everything exactly where it should be, except for Branson himself. Bob initially thought maybe Branson had gone to stay with friends. It wasn't impossible. Branson didn't have a working car at the time, but he could have hitchhiked. He had friends in Kansas City, about 100 miles south. Maybe he'd gone there and would come back in a few days, but as the days passed, the theory became harder and harder to believe. Branson's wallet was at the house. His money was untouched. He hadn't packed any clothes. And perhaps most tellingly, he hadn't contacted anyone. Not his father, not his mother, not his grandmother, not his friends. For someone to leave without telling anyone, without taking anything, without making contact for days on end, that wasn't like Branson. Everyone who knew him said the same thing. He might have been struggling with drugs. He might have been dealing with the aftermath of what happened with Jason Bierman. But he wasn't the type to just disappear without a word. By April 16th, 5 days after Branson was last seen, the family's concern had turned to genuine fear. On Monday morning, April 16th, Joanne Stinnett met with Bob Perry and Rebecca Kleinow, Branson's mother, at the Nottoway County Sheriff's Office. Together, they filed an official missing person report. The investigation had begun. But in Skidmore, Missouri, a town that had learned decades earlier how to keep its mouth shut, an investigation only works if people are willing to talk. Sheriff Ben Espy of Nottoway County immediately organized search parties. The strategy was simple and methodical. Start close to the Perry residence and work outward. Search every field, every farm, every abandoned building within a 15-mile radius. Volunteers came forward. Dozens of people, including law enforcement, family members, and community members, spread out across Nottoway County. They combed through fields where crops were just beginning to grow in the spring soil. They searched barns and outbuildings that hadn't been used in years. They checked old wells and outhouses. They walked along fence lines and creek beds. They looked everywhere that seemed like a place someone could hide a body. or where someone might have wandered in a drug-induced state and gotten hurt. The search went on for days. Nothing. No trace of Branson Perry. No clothing. No personal items. No signs of a struggle. Nothing that suggested he had been anywhere in that 15-mile radius. Meanwhile, law enforcement began the painstaking process of interviewing everyone connected to Branson's life. Over the following month and a half, investigators conducted more than 100 interviews. Friends, acquaintances, people who knew him from school, people who might have seen him that day, anyone who might have information. And then there was the matter of the shed. When police first searched the property on April 17th, they looked in the shed where Branson had allegedly been taking the jumper cables. The cables weren't there. This was noted in the initial report. The very item Branson had supposedly gone to put away was missing. 2 weeks later, investigators returned to the property for a follow-up search. This time, when they opened the shed door, the jumper cables were sitting just inside the entrance, right where they should have been, right where Branson would have placed them if he'd made it to the shed that day. So what does this mean? Did someone place the cables there after the initial search? Did the police simply miss them the first time? Were the cables there all along, and investigators just didn't see them? Or did the cables reappear as part of some elaborate staging to make it look like Branson had completed his task before vanishing? Rebecca Clino, Branson's mother, would later state publicly that she believed the cables were planted. She thought the police didn't find them initially because they weren't there, and then someone put them in the shed later to confuse the investigation, or to make it look like Branson had made it to the shed before whatever happened to him happened. But who would do that? And why? And how would they have accessed the shed without being noticed, especially after a missing person investigation was underway and the property was being watched? These questions haunted investigators. Because if the jumper cables appeared after the initial search, it meant someone was actively interfering with the investigation. It meant someone knew what happened to Branson and was trying to control the narrative. Jana Crawford, the friend who was with Branson that day, was interviewed extensively. She admitted to police that she and Branson had used marijuana and methamphetamines together that afternoon. This revelation shifted the investigation in a new direction. Maybe this wasn't about Bierman. Maybe this was about drugs. A family member came forward and told police that Branson had been in possession of a bottle of Valium on the day he disappeared. Combined with Jenna's admission about the methamphetamines, investigators began to wonder if Branson had been more deeply involved in the local drug scene than anyone realized. Law enforcement began questioning Branson's known drug acquaintances in St. Joseph, a larger city about 30 minutes south of Skidmore. Everyone they interviewed said the same thing. They hadn't seen Branson. They had no idea where he was. And crucially, they all passed polygraph examinations. Despite rumors circulating that Branson owed money to drug dealers, or that he was planning to turn people in to the police in exchange for leniency on his own charges, investigators couldn't find any concrete evidence to support these theories. The local drug trade was investigated more thoroughly, but no discernible leads emerged. Then came the tips. Multiple people reported seeing Branson after April 11th, at a house northeast of Skidmore, near the tiny community of Quitman. This house had a reputation. Everyone knew it was a place where drugs were bought and sold. If you wanted methamphetamines in Nottoway County, this was one of the places you could go. The timeline here is critical. Branson disappeared on April 11th. According to reports, this house in Quitman burned down sometime between April 13th and April 16th. That's less than a week after Branson vanished. And it happened before he was even officially reported missing. Darren White, who was a Nottoway County Sheriff's deputy in 2001 and would later serve as sheriff from 2009 to 2017, was on duty the night the fire was reported. He would later tell reporters that the timing of the fire was deeply suspicious. The best theory, he said, was that Branson was murdered in that house, and then the house was deliberately burned to destroy all evidence. Think about that timeline. If Branson was killed in that house on or shortly after April 11th, and the house was burned within days, that means whoever killed him acted quickly to cover their tracks. They burned the entire structure to the ground, destroying any blood evidence, DNA, fingerprints, or forensic material that could have linked them to a murder. And they did it before Branson Perry was even reported missing. Which means they knew he was never coming back. Which means they knew he was dead. But despite these theories, despite the suspicious timing, despite multiple witnesses claiming they saw Branson at that house, law enforcement couldn't prove anything. The house was gone. Any evidence that might have existed was destroyed in the fire. And the people who lived there, the people who would have known what happened, weren't talking. Because this is Skidmore. And in Skidmore, people don't talk. April 10, 2003. 2 years after Branson Perry disappeared, law enforcement arrested a 59-year-old Presbyterian minister and Boy Scout leader named Jack Wayne Rogers. The charges had nothing to do with Branson. Rogers had been arrested for first-degree assault and practicing medicine without a license after he performed a makeshift gender reassignment surgery on a transgender woman in a hotel room in Columbia, Missouri. The surgery went horribly wrong, and the woman nearly died. When police searched Rogers' home and electronic devices as part of that investigation, they found something that made them stop in their tracks: child pornography. Hundreds, maybe thousands of images. But that wasn't what caught their attention in relation to Branson Perry. It was the online forum posts. Rogers had been active in dark corners of the internet under usernames like Buggerbutt, Oh Hail Satan, and Extreme Body Mods. In these forums, he'd written detailed, graphic descriptions of abducting, raping, torturing, and murdering young men. In one post, he described picking up a blonde male hitchhiker in Skidmore, Missouri. According to the post, Rogers took this young man to a remote location, sexually assaulted him, tortured him, and then killed him before burying the body in the Ozarks. The description matched Branson Perry: blonde hair, Skidmore, young, hitchhiking, which made sense because Branson didn't have a working car. Investigators also found a turtle claw necklace in Rogers' vehicle. Branson Perry had owned a turtle claw necklace. It wasn't a common item. The similarities were too specific to ignore. When confronted, Rogers denied everything. He claimed the online posts were fantasies, fiction. He said he'd never met Branson Perry, never been to Skidmore, never harmed anyone in the way he'd described online. And despite the detailed nature of the posts, despite the necklace, despite the location match, there was no physical evidence connecting Rogers to Branson's disappearance. Missouri Highway Patrol spokesperson Chris Ricks summed up the problem perfectly. Because of the anonymity of the internet, he said, people have a tendency to exaggerate or to just out and out lie. In other words, Rogers could have been telling the truth about it being a fantasy. Or he could have been confessing to murder in plain sight, hiding behind the veil of internet anonymity. There was no way to know for sure. In 2004, Rogers was convicted on the charges related to the transgender woman and the child pornography. He was sentenced to 17 years for assault and illegal surgery, 7 years for performing illegal surgery, and 30 years for the child pornography charges, all to run concurrently. His earliest possible release date is October 30th, 2028, when he'll be 83 years old. At his sentencing, Rebecca Clino, Branson's mother, was in the courtroom. She begged Rogers to tell her what happened to her son. Where was he? What had Rogers done? Rogers looked at her and repeated what he'd said all along. He had nothing to do with Branson Perry's disappearance. He'd never met Branson. The online posts were just fantasies from a disturbed mind.